Well, this is our third national session. Helen, do you want to start sharing your screen and get us off to a good start?
So I'm Heleen van Soest with PBL. I'll present the work on the COMMIT consortium. This paper has been published in Nature Communications recently on the global rollout of comprehensive policy measures that may aid in bridging the emissions gap. Move to the next slide. Right. Okay. So this study started from the observation that you all know, of course, that there's an emissions gap in 2030 between where we need to be for the Paris Agreement and where we are headed. So we said, okay, we need to strengthen not just the NDCs, so the targets for 2030, but also the actually implemented climate policies. And can we do that maybe in a way that goes beyond the cost optimal scenarios? And that idea was inspired by work that has been published by different colleagues. So notably Kriegler et al., Fekete et al., and Roelsema et al., who's also here, on good practice policies, which are defined as successfully implemented policies in one or more countries with a noticeable impact on greenhouse gas emissions. So we said, okay, let's take that as a starting point. Can we do a sort of global rollout of these good practice policies until 2030, which is then followed by a transition to 2-degree pathways, or well below 2-degree pathways, which is also sort of informed by the idea on policy sequencing. So it assumes basically that having these good practice policies in the short term helps prepare the ground for more comprehensive carbon pricing thereafter, and follow these steps identified in policy sequencing ideas more smoothly. And it goes also beyond this earlier work in being both a multimodal study. The earlier work was based on a more limited number of models, and having more national details, because the replicability of these policies, of course, heavily depends on the national context. And that's why we use the strength of the COMMIT consortium to add a differentiation in timing and or stringency of the targets in consultation with our national partners. And ultimately, we arrived at two income groups, basically, high and middle or low income. And in some cases, for specific measures, also another group that depended a bit on the measures. And this is the full list then of the measures that we identified per sector that need to be implemented until 2030, after which transition to the 2-degree pathway was made. And I'll just highlight a few actually per sector. So for example, increasing afforestation and reforestation, but also halting deforestation. So that's nicely in line with the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on forest and land use. Energy supply, for example, stopping the installations of unabated coal power plants, which is also in line with the Glasgow Declaration. Improving the efficiency of existing buildings, so renovation industry, reducing emissions from adipic acid production, increasing the share of non-fossil in vehicle sales, and reducing methane emissions from waste, which is also nicely relevant to the global methane pledge that was made in Glasgow. And finally, for example, also the reducing F-gas emissions, which is actually based on the Kigali agreement. And there's more, but these are just a few examples to give you an idea of how concrete these measures are that we implemented in the short term until 2030. And then, so we did that with both the global models, 9 of them were part of this study, and national models. I won't present the results here, but there's a separate paper on that actually. And then we had a full set of scenarios. So I've been talking mostly about the bridge scenario, but to compare it to some reference cases, we have the BAU current policies and NDCs, and I'll focus on the current policies and NDCs. And then also the cost optimal 2-degree cases, either starting in 2020 or 2030. So that's what the main projections look like. Total greenhouse gas emissions until 2050. The median is given by the thick line and dots, and then all the individual model results are given by the different model line types. And what we basically see is that current policies are still expected to lead to increasing emissions, NDCs as well, though at a slightly lower level. What's needed for the optimal 2-degree cases is a really rapid reduction. This is all not very new, but then as all for comparison, actually also the 1.5 degree scenarios from CD Links are included. What's new, of course, is the bridge scenario, and that's the green one. And that closes the emissions gap between the NDCs and 2 degrees by roughly 2/3 by 2030 and fully by 2050. So it enables a pathway in line with well below 2 degrees, while being based on a much more concrete set of measures in the short term. And it does so notably through emission reductions in energy supply, as this waterfall chart shows. So the past emissions in 2015 are on the left, and it shows the sectoral contributions to that. The NDC emissions are a second bar. The bridge is the bar totally on the right. And the upper panel is 2030, lower panel is 2050. And then each sector's contribution to the reductions between NDCs and bridge is shown as the individual waterfall elements. And energy supply there is the biggest part, but also, for example, transport and non-CO2 in many of the models are important contributors. And this is actually an illustration of the image model, but we also present the full ranges in the paper. But this is a rather illustrative trend that you see here. And these sectoral reductions, if we zoom in a bit further, are enabled by renewables, which is a panel on the left, upper left. It shows the share of renewables in electricity. Left is 2030, right is 2050, and then the colors are the scenarios as shown before. So the bridge scenario does a scale up, especially by 2050, but not so much more so than the 2-degree cases. And that's the case for many of these indicators. So it doesn't present an additional burden, you could say. There's also electrification in the demand sectors like transportation, which is the second panel. Efficiency improvements, but also afforestation helps to reduce emissions in this case. Finally, we looked at costs, actually, which is always very interesting. On the left, you see that GDP loss per ton of CO2 equivalent abated in the bridge scenario relative to the current policy scenario, and then presented relative to the 2-degree cases. And what you would see here is that it is more expensive than the 2-degree 2020 case by 2050, but it's cheaper in the shorter term. And it's also cheaper than the 2-degree 2030 case. So it's cheaper than delay, and also in terms of carbon prices, which is presented on the right. We see a similar story. Of course, this is not perfect. There's a couple of points for discussion. So for one thing, this distinction between high and lower income countries in the targets in the bridge scenario is, of course, an advance on previous work, but still, well, maybe a second best option. But we didn't find good arguments for much more detailed distinction, and this was also in the done in an intense process with the national partners. So actually approved or said to be relevant for their national circumstances. Of course, also the implementation of the different specific measures differs a bit across models, but having this as a multimodal study allows for more robust assessment. The carbon price turned out to be, well, a very effective policy, actually. If you took it out, emission reductions in the bridge scenario were a bit lower, but we still thought it deserved a spot in the selection as it reflects the current good practices that are already there in like emission trading systems, etc. And it has very differentiated levels and pathways across countries, and doesn't start at too high levels. So it's still a rather feasible implementation. We didn't account for the effect of COVID-19, so effectively assuming a full recovery. Also didn't, due to the cutoff date of the work, account for all the newest NDCs, but these are expected to lead to a limited additional reduction. So it wouldn't affect the headline findings. And finally, we didn't run a specific 1.5 degree scenario. So that will be a next step, I think. So in summary, scaling up successful policies with differentiation as done here in the bridge scenario may actually help to reach well below 2 degree target. It closes the gap, this bridge scenario, by 2/3 by 2030 through increasing renewables, electrification, efficiency improvements, afforestation, etc., with levels and rates of change that are actually lower than the cost optimal 2 degree cases. So it's still rather feasible, we argue. But it should be said that these are not yet sufficient for 1.5 degrees. And on their own, these successful policies, the good practice policies, are not enough. They need to be combined with comprehensive carbon pricing after 2030. Or in addition, the early regulatory action as done in the bridge scenario, which is non-cost optimal, you could say, is actually preferred over delay. Even though it has higher costs in 2050, it has lower carbon prices and costs in 2030 and overall lower policy costs than the 2 degree 2030 case. So all in all, we think that scaling up such good practice policies may help pave the way for comprehensive carbon pricing and keep 2 degrees within reach. And that's it.
AJ says, thanks, Helena. Did a message come through on the key policy or relatively few policies to try to push to get the biggest emissions reductions? So in other words, when you look at the at that slide, which is very small type and lots of policies, were there, I'm sure that there's a ranking. Were some of them really, big hitters and others sort of just, around the edges?
Yeah, that's a good question that I always get, actually, because it's very logical to ask that. So one answer would be maybe the carbon pricing, because when we took it out, we ran it as sort of sensitivity case. You saw quite a big effect on emissions, so that would be one thing, but that's maybe not the answer you want to hear, right? It's carbon pricing has been studied much more often already. I always think it's important to actually say that scenarios like these show that action across all sectors is needed, and you can't pick just one or two. You need all of them, I guess. And we haven't really looked at running each one individually to see which has the largest effect, but my colleague Mark has, so maybe he wants to add something here.
Yeah, so what I'm doing is actually work in progress, and I especially looked at the policies in so the currently implemented policies and not just good practice policies. That's something that I might have to add in the near future, and it was actually interesting to see. I think that I did it 2 years ago, and I redid it now, and that especially the carbon pricing has become more effective, and I think because there is more implementation of, and there's also, so you see in the current policy scenario also that especially carbon pricing or emission trading is one of the most effective, at least, policies. But yeah, so I can imagine that this happens also in the good practice policy case. In that sense.
Thank you. Yeah.
To study. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, it's just so interesting for us to think about where we might need to spend limited political capital in the coming years. So those kind of insights are really, really interesting and important. Thanks.
Yeah, but so my question still is, I mean, our models are suited very much for carbon pricing. So yeah, so that's, I think, still the main question, if it's model intrinsic or if it's real in real life. That's something I'm still thinking about.
Well, since we have a little bit of time to discuss this, in some ways, it's about the policies themselves that we choose that are the non-tax policies. Or I'll make an equivalence between the taxes and the carbon market prices. But basically, there are, there are lots of policies that we haven't even thought to implement yet. I know that many years ago, and this was even before the Kyoto Protocol, we were running some scenarios that were just regulatory policies, and they proved to be extremely effective in terms of reducing emissions, and they were relatively simple. It was a new source performance standard in power generation. That is, you couldn't build after, I think it was 2030, which at that time seemed like so far out in the future that it was meaningless. But if you couldn't build anything that emitted in the power sector, then the old stuff eventually went away. It might have been 2020, but the old stuff went away, because in addition to the new source performance standard, you just said, after a certain number of years, you've timed out and you're declared new. And if you're in violation, you have to shut down. So that plus something very similar in the refining sector, where the refining sector and that I think was 2030, could no longer pass net carbon forward into the system. So all the hydrocarbons, if you wanted to drive around or use liquids or solids, actually it's all liquids, it's refining, but they all had to have a biological origin, or at least enough offsetting net carbon removal to enable those to meet this no net forward delivery of carbon into the system. And back then we were getting emissions reductions that would be consistent with certainly with 2 degrees, and we haven't gone back to revisit it because it was extremely unpopular. Omkar, if I apologize for mispronouncing names, but
no, that's correct. Thank you. So since we are discussing about the economic versus regulatory instruments, I had a question on those lines, and I'm a new modeler, so this is kind of might sound naive, but what I was thinking was there are a lot of regulatory instruments that need to be then taken into the model, and I wanted to know if those were taken in the model in that sense. And once you take the regulatory instruments in the model, how do you then play with them? So one is in case of carbon tax, you can say that the tax was $20 or $40 or $100. But in case of regulatory instruments, do we then say that it was achieved 50% or 100%? Or are there other ways of dealing with regulatory instruments in the model? Thank you.
Thanks. And that's a good question. Also a bit difficult for me because this is a multi-model study, so it differs a bit per model. So for example, in the image model, we can put in many of those because we have rather high granularity, and we can put those in, but not more financially related instruments. But in a CGE model, this might be different. So this really depends a bit on the models, and we have, I think, very different model types represented here. So we'd need to sit down with the different modelers to see how they did it in their model. I can't give one answer for the whole set here, but you're right that this indeed is not so straightforward for each model type. And that's, I guess, why we also see that not the entire set was implemented in all models. Some models can't simply represent each and every one of these instruments, but we made an effort, and I think that's a good starting point. But yeah, sometimes some sort of parameterization is needed to to actually achieve this kind of high headline target that we set, which is similar to what we do for the current policies scenarios. But maybe, yeah, I won't take too much time, sorry.
Yeah. Vaibhav?
I just wanted to come back to the earlier comment or discussion on the policy instrument, and if carbon price is sort of more real than the regulatory policies as was discussed. I think the country context really matters, and how countries are thinking about in their context these instruments becomes very interesting to note. So I think till the time a country, the way it wants to demonstrate leadership, let climate action, what many countries are doing are saying that, well, we will demonstrate climate leadership through just, renewable focused policies. So we will have feed-in tariffs, and we'll have capital subsidies, and we'll have other instruments. These focus on only on this particular sector, and this will lead to emission mitigation. And well, I'm doing a lot of good climate action, but these are not necessarily bending the emissions curve, because these could be fast-growing economies, or economies in the earlier stages of economic development. So the emissions are rising in absolute sense, right? But the moment this context changes, when countries start thinking about absolute, like bending the curve, reduction in peaking and then reduction, then the context definitely changes. Then just talking about renewable energy doesn't suffice. Then it is about, well, how are you reducing coal? So then this context becomes very different. And that's what, for example, we are seeing in India. Till now, the debate has been so much on renewable energy, that pushing renewable energy into the, and that's great kind of climate action. And hence all the policies are kind of centered around it. The moment, and that's why I do think the context, in fact, the global context across many countries has changed in the last 2 years after this net zero debate start happening. Because now countries are kind of seriously thinking about bending the emissions curve. And the moment this context changes, just pushing renewable energy does not suffice. Then we have to take a call on, okay, you have to reduce coal also. So then, and that is why increasingly carbon pricing, it might not be a universal ideal global carbon price, but within country carbon pricing through emission trading or carbon taxes, that is in fact becoming much more real. So we will see maybe renewable energy policies or sectoral policies continuing, but we will increasingly see, a carbon tax kind of policy instrument becoming much more real. Might not be idealized global, but definitely in their own national context, many countries will start moving, just because the context of climate leadership and action is changing so fast now.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a very good point. And maybe just only to add is that, well, this is exactly why we did this with a whole suite of global and national models, and especially have this whole package defined in consultation with the national experts to really try and account for these national circumstances. And second, I guess, is with these kind of more regulatory policies, at least you sort of prepare the ground for such carbon pricing kind of instruments, and build up the institutional capacity and conditions like that you need to get those instruments going. So that's also the idea behind this kind of scenario. But yeah, totally agree. Thanks.
Yeah, Alan.
Thanks. Thanks, Heleen, for a fascinating presentation and a really good discussion here. I think this discussion of these non-price-based instruments and regulatory approaches is really important. Jay talked about some of the older exercises. One that we did a while ago was in EMF 24. We looked at comparing a bunch of quantity-based price cap and trade policies for the U.S. and developing a kind of an optimal frontier and comparing them to sectoral, more regulatory policies. And it turned out our electricity sectoral policy, the clean energy standard, ended up being a lot of the models even more efficient than the cap and trade policies, which was somewhat a surprising result when we first started seeing it in some of the models, but it bore out. And I think looking at the policy debate and at least from a U.S. perspective, what we've seen is kind of the carbon taxes just have a huge political economy problem. It is just really difficult to get those types of policies through. There was a big push in Build Back Better for a CES-like policy with the CEPP, or CEEP. I'm probably getting that acronym wrong. And even that, ended up falling out of the bill because this is a really wicked political problem to get anything through. But from a modeling perspective, I think we have a challenge of trying to represent these or understand these sort of political economy constraints and see what are the types of policies that are actually feasible going forward. And they're hard to model. Ankar's question about how do we actually get this kind of stuff in the model is a good one, particularly in sort of these exploratory types of scenarios. It's really easy to solve the carbon tax that is optimal and gets you to the constraint, but it's a lot harder to see if that's not on the table, what are the suite of second best policies that are second best getting to you to whatever target you're trying to reach. But I think we have to try to do a better job of modeling these and understanding what are the constraints on policymakers and trying to get these sorts of things in place, and what is it they're optimizing over? Because things like you want to decarbonize the power sector, but electrify everything, and a simple carbon tax-based policy may be great to decarbonize the power sector, but it might be raising electricity prices and making it difficult to then push out, electrify all of those end uses. And also just what are the distributional effects that they're considering? How is that distributed regionally within a country, within different interest groups, et cetera? And what are some of the the follow-on effects? Are policies that are really bringing down the cost of particular technologies able to spread more easily? Are you enabling other parties to decarbonize more easily? Or are you leading by example and showing here's a policy suite that will be able to spread and be adopted by other parties? Understanding some of these constraints on policymakers and why we're not seeing as many price-based policies actually implemented is really important. But it's a really wicked hard modeling problem. It's not straightforward to put into our models, and but it's worth trying. So thanks. This was a really fascinating discussion.
May I add just very quick twofold? Very quickly, for one thing, that's why we actually had a different pathway for the US for the carbon price, because we knew this was an issue there. That's not reflected on this slide. And second is that in the Engage project, for example, we're looking much more into these kind of questions. But maybe Mark wants to add, actually. See your hand.
Yeah, so I think this is a very important and very interesting topic that Ellen is raising, and especially that was also difficult for us or to convince the reviewers, because these are the limitations of the integrated assessment model. Now, I mean, what we do is we have a policy instrument, but we translate it to a target. So we can implement so many CO2 per kilowatt hours or so many per kilometers, or but we don't, well, at least as long as it's not an SE, but the normal integrated model doesn't have distributional effects, doesn't include capacity or institutional strength or whatever. So I think what you are raising now is I don't know, something more that should be then outside the model and should be somehow linked to the results. And yeah, I think that's definitely something where we have to go in the next few years.
I'm hoping have a equally stimulating presentation. I believe the presenter is Dirk-Jan.
So yes, thank you, Heleen, for this presentation and the interesting discussion around it. I'm going to present this this study that we did in terms of the Programs Reinforced project. It's another EU Commission project that was financed 2 years ago, and based on a recent paper published in Nature Climate Change led by our CICERO colleagues from Ida Sognnaes and Glenn Peters. So it's on a multimodal analysis of long-term emission and warming implications of current mitigation efforts. So the idea about around our motivation behind this study is that we saw kind of a reality gap in IM scenarios. On the one hand, we have this no policy, a lot of no policy baseline scenarios that go up to 8.5 radiative forcing or 4-5 degree temperature increase, and like idealized mitigation scenarios that match like 2 or 1.5 degree Paris target by construction. But currently we see a reality where we are probably somewhere in between with policies and pledges. Well, this is of course also the way how these scenarios are being set up, like a deviation from no policy scenario to an ideal policy scenario. We also saw some potential demand for IEM efforts to project what is the part we are really on. So instead of doing backcasting, which is very common in IEM scenarios, so just forcing your model to get to a certain temperature target or emission target, we used forecasting. So also with a multimodal analysis. So the difference is if you do a multimodal analysis with backcasting, that you are analyzing the spread in the model in the mitigation path, so in the amount of CCS or maybe even the mitigation cost. But we have we more all the same policies and then forecast what impact it has on emissions and finally temperature. Of course, here we are an issue with the time because short policies and pledges are only defined until 2030, around 2030. Well, temperature increase, we commonly talk about 2100. So in this study, we use two methods to extrapolate our current and state ambition in mitigation. So which I will explain later. Our paper is more or less related to some recent papers, like the one of Rosema, Mark, on taking stock of national climate policies of last year. The one of Fawcett as well in 2015, but also the more recent one from the GCAM team, where they also basically extrapolate current pledges until 2100. And also the Frontisi paper from 2018, where they also relate current ambitions with with long-term targets. In our study, we use 7 models. So we try to have a heterogeneous set of models to do this analysis, because really we want to explore where model certainty, the spread of model uncertainty that we are having, that's related with modeling current mitigation efforts. So we have partial equilibrium models, GCAM, TRMUs, but quite different ones, all 3. We have CGEs like Iceland and Germany, ETME and macroeconomic model, and 42 an energy system model. So since we really wanted to have the model spread, the spread of the outcomes defined by the model type and not so much by the model inputs, we did this harmonization exercise, which has been published in earlier this year in Science of Total Environment. So we first had the reference, the common reference that every model use. So they have, and you see on the left the spread of emissions from 2050 to 2030. If everybody run their own normal scenarios, the baselines, then we see how that difference when we harmonize socioeconomics. We see some differences in lines, but the spread is more or less the same. But then if we go on also on harmonizing costs, so technology cost for some models, for other models also fossil fuel cost, fossil fuel prices, we somehow decrease the spread of model outcomes. And if we also harmonize policies, current policies in our models, we see that the spread between models is declining a lot. So this is kind of what we want to see, that since we have similar policies, we hope that at least at the time for the period that we model those policies, the spread is reasonable between the models. Then we have 4 scenarios plus a baseline plus one internal scenario, which I will explain later. But the main 4 scenarios are 2 current policy scenarios and 2 NDC scenarios. And then we have both connected with a different extrapolation method. Firstly, we have the constant rate of emission intensity. So this is basically the same method as applied in the Fawcett paper in 2015, where we look at how from the benchmark here for each model until 2030, how the emissions per unit of GDP has been decreasing over time, or have been evolving over time, and we extend it until 2050 or 2100, depending on the model. So basically, after 2030, there's kind of a backcasting, because then you put an upper bound on emissions based on this extrapolation, and we have like a price-based extrapolation method, where we measure like the carbon price, which is equivalent to the current policy effort in 2030. And then we extend it in the future with GDP per capita. So this is kind of a forecasting method, because here you let the model forecast the amount of emissions based on the carbon price that is informed by current policies or NDCs. So this, for the second method, I can explain this graphically, because this may not be straightforward. So we have like a scenario until 2030 with current policies, that each policy will decrease some of emissions, and then we model a second one where we take away the policies, but we put this achieved mitigation effort as a cap. So we get a carbon price that calculates that's required to get this same mitigation level. Then this carbon price we extend it with GDP per capita over time until 2050 or 2100. And then we implement current policies, but put that line that we saw in the third. Well, actually, this third graph is actually the price-only scenario that we saw in the previous slide. So this is used as a upper bound on emissions on the final scenario, where we implement current policies. Same is done for NDCs. But since NDCs in some countries are like more ambitious than current policies, this is like additional amount of effort until 2030, which is usually reached by a carbon price. And we do the same effort. Basically, we take away all the current policies, and we only apply the mitigation level and extend the carbon price that is related to that. Now there are some. This is done for each region separately. So for each model region. So there are some regions where current policy may be more ambitious than the NDC targets, certainly because we use NDC targets from 2015, the initial targets. So in these regions, actually we took the current policies, we took the most ambitious part. So for those regions where current policies are more ambitious, the NDC and current policy scenario will be the same. We get to these emission outcomes. So you see that until 2030, for both current policies and NDC, we get quite similar, a relatively small range of emission outcomes. But then from 2030, the results spread out widely, and the model spread becomes like huge, like 17 gigatons already in 2050. Both for NDC and for price. NDC is slightly lower. And if we translate this to temperatures, we get a temperatures of 2.2 to 2.7 degrees for NDC, so 2.3, 2.9 for current policies. So it does show this like there's a huge spread, and after that is not enough yet, but that's what's more or less known. But we are more interested in like so in the spread in this paper. So for that, we also focus a bit on the decomposition of the outcomes. So we look at historical emissions, which are maybe slightly different for each country in 2015, and then the baseline increase. So how much would emission increase until 2050 without any policies? Then the reduction we get from the policies applied, and the total. And this shows that, for example, there's already like a huge difference in models, really caused by the type of model applied. So Germany as like a 15 gigaton increase until 2050, and MUSE by default already a 6 gigaton decrease. So this already, of course, is a big difference for the big reason for the spread, and also other reasons like we see that the type of extrapolation method is very important for CGEs like Germany, ICES that increase a lot, where the mitigation decrease a lot when you move from price to the intensity scenarios. Well, this difference is relatively small in GCAM and TM. So probably like the price scenario is already more the partial equilibrium models already more sensitive to the price scenarios, while the CGEs kind of have to be forced to get these emission reductions to like the intensity targets. Also quickly on CCS. So we since we have this price only scenario that I explained, where we implement the same target but with only a carbon price. We compare this to the scenario where we really modeled the policies, and we see this big difference that like there's a lot more CCS when we only model the carbon price, and we also see that if we extend this to the 2100s, we see like before 2030 when actual policies are measured, we hardly see CCS, and then for after 2030, like carbon prices take up increasingly important importance on the mitigation portfolio as the current policies are left constant. So we get to kind of CCS amounts that are comparable to other modeling exercises. So some conclusion from this paper is that we use seven heterogeneous models to and this reveals that there's a strong method-driven uncertainty in temperature projections, because the choice of model has showed to be the most important variable, and more important than the extrapolation method used for current emission, and also that's again more important than the real 2030 ambition. And since we don't think there's one perfect model, because every model has its advantages and disadvantages, from this you conclude that every study from a single model will give us a false sense of precision on where emissions are really headed. Also, we think that policy representation matters. I think all the discussion that we had before dives a lot in this topic. That we notice that backcasting exercises may provide unrealistic pathways and overestimate like technologies like CCS. Well, policy nowadays is focused really more on regulation standards or incentives, then more than uniform carbon prices. And also some limitations, for example, that the policy and the pledges were not updated with the latest announcements, because we started this project like more than a year ago. This is probably also like the something that will always happen with multimodal exercises, because you have to communicate to so many teams that you always lag behind the latest ambitions. Also, if you have this strong model heterogeneity, the input and policy harmonization is more complicated, because every model has different sectors, different type of inputs. So this is another complexity to really harmonize this. And finally, it would be very important to really map emission outcomes to model features. We have tried to do that a bit by the decomposition, but we couldn't really map every outcome. And it will be really interesting, really important work, but it's also very difficult work. It was outside the scope of this paper. So thank you for your attention. Any questions, just ask now or by email. Oh.
I think you've got a question already in the queue, Volker. Put it in the chat, but maybe you could just articulate it, Volker.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the opportunity to ask the question, and to Dirk-Jan for the interesting presentation. I had two short questions, hopefully. I mean, one takeaway from your study, but also others, to me seems basically better not to extrapolate, because what you get is really, you can find a model and extrapolation method combination that basically gets you to any emission level that you want, if I say it a bit in sloppy words. Would you support that statement? And then secondly, could you say a few words about the cutoff dates that you applied in your current policy and NDC analysis, which is often really important information to be able to compare results across different models. And frankly, I think there's too little information often in the analysis provided on this matter, and then you're basically lost, right? In particular, in a dynamic policy environment that we're in now, where NDCs got kind of heavily updated in some cases over the past year. It really matters whether you're representing the state of policy in April 2020 or in July 2021. And even papers that have come out over the past couple of months, some have as recent results as early 2021 cutoff, and others are basically state of play pre-COVID. So it's really two worlds that you're comparing here. So that would be nice if you could comment on that one.
So yes, so on the cutoff date, that's actually a good point, and it's also actually I noticed in the last weeks we got quite some attention in the media, and where we were like falsely, where journalists falsely interpret that we are modeling like Glasgow announcement, which is not the case. We used the unconditional targets from the initial NDCs from 2015, and also like policies more or less until early 2020. So that's the cutoff date. But can you repeat your first question? I was not entirely sure what I.
Yeah, my interpretation of your analysis was basically stay away from extrapolating these trends, because you can. I mean, unless you've done the extrapolation yourself, you might get really any number by picking the right model extrapolation method combination.
Yeah, well, the idea of the extrapolation models was that we want to have models that kind of show what every region basically have shown in ambition in the last year. So of course, if you have like an emission intensity, you get like a hard target, right? But then on the other hand, if you use that, maybe you already exhausted your main mitigation method. So maybe this hard target is much more difficult or very easy to achieve in the years after, because you still have so many easy mitigation methods. On the other hand, like the price method kind of catches that, because it shows like the price compared of your current ambitions, like a equivalent carbon price. But then the model kind of decide like if there's still a lot of easy mitigation options, then they will still be used with a relatively low carbon price. So you may get a lot of mitigation based on that, or not if you really needed if you really need a higher carbon price to get to deeper mitigation. So the idea was that they are really informed by current ambition. We also noticed in other studies that they often abstain from extrapolation to keep it constant or so. But since our objective was to see where we are headed with current ambitions, we couldn't really abstain because it was one of the goals of the paper.
AJ, you want to come in to this discussion?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jay. Yeah, I mean, I think I basically agree with Volker's point. You can get a wide range of extrapolations depending on the model used, and we showed it's actually quite model dependent after a reasonable degree of harmonization. I guess that's important. We have lots of conversations in the modeling community about structural differences between models, as well as sort of differing input assumptions. So I guess the study was trying to shine a light on some of those structural differences, and also just to make explicit how the assumption used to extrapolate is kind of pretty consequential. I was really surprised after Paris how so many analyses and studies said, you know, the Paris pledges mean we are on track for a 3.1 degree world, or, you know, a 2.9 degree world. There were a few studies that showed that we were maybe on track for a 4 degree world after Paris as well. Obviously, things are a little bit happier now. We're not on track probably for a 4 degree world. Nevertheless, there is still quite a wide range. So I guess we hope the study is useful in shining a bit of a light on how to attach method and model to the ultimate outcome of the very long run extrapolation that you perform after 2030.
Mark, you want to comment here?
Yes, thanks. Nice presentation, Jan. It's really interesting stuff. And yeah, I find it also very important to find out if the uncertainty is coming from models or from reality. That's always. But I just have a clarifying question. At some point, you said you also did some policy harmonization between models. Could you elaborate a little on that? What did you do there? Because why didn't these policies were already in the original one then?
I mean, the policy had to be modeled by all the models, right? So we kind of use the policy database to model all these the same type of policies between all the models. But that means with policy harmonization. Of course, this was not perfect. I've actually a slide on this because some models are much more diverse than other models, and they could take much more type of policies. We use this. We build upon the policy database that I think you used also in your paper from the
from New Climate.
But then there was some models that couldn't run various type of policies. Also, this one like here is by type of policy. So we kind of harmonize that between the models as much as they could implement policies.
Yeah. Okay. I recognized the kind of issue we had the same, that not all models were. But so you said policy. So policy harmonization does make the range smaller. But what was the scenario before you did this? Was this just an SSP2 scenario, or?
Yeah. So this one.
Yeah, that's the one.
That's like the no policy scenario basically.
Okay.
The harmonization is like a no policy scenario.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Maybe I'll take the chair's prerogative of commenting that what I found is that the difference between the models as a structural entity versus what assumptions are built into the models by the modelers, and they are many, range from the character of a technology, what's its cost and performance and how does it evolve, to what is reasonable. Often there are constraints as to what the modelers think is a reasonable limit on things that are embedded in the models, and these things go in to prevent the models from going off into spaces that are after the fact ridiculous, and the modelers know they're ridiculous, and so they inhibit them. And it's not so much the structure of the model per se, but what's going on behind the scenes. So beginning to unpack that kind of difference, I mean, you would think that the difference between a intertemporal optimization model that assumes that all of the economic agents in the entire world know the price of everything for the next century would give you a radically different result than a dynamic recursive model in which the economic actors are, from one period to the next, moving forward in a way that is consistent with their prior behavior. And you would think they would be just, worlds apart, that the optimization models would go to corner solutions, and that the dynamic recursive models would sort of muddle along. But that's not always the case. And what you find is that everybody is trying to make their models reasonable. And as a consequence, there's a lot of stuff built into these models that isn't structural. And I think that unpacking those differences, those subtle or not so subtle assumptions that all of the models are making, and bringing them out into the light so we have a better sense of what's driving the results would be really helpful. And I think this is the kind of study in which, if you go to the next level, it's not just the model or its structural type. And I noticed that, the structural typology, actually could be much, have much greater granularity. I think this kind of study is exactly what we need to develop a better understanding of really what's driving our results. As Volker was pointing out, just that one little piece. What's the rule you use for extrapolating? How do you do that extrapolation? It's not that one is wrong and the other's right, so much as we just need to get a better sense of what the implication of that extrapolation is. Anyway, this is a great study. Any other final words as we finish up this set of three scenarios? I'm sorry, three sessions on national policies and measures. Elena.
Yeah, only if I'm the only one, because I've been talking a lot already. I would have more comments and thoughts, but maybe we should take that to a lounge network session later. But maybe just a very quick question still. I saw you had some models with timeline or time horizon 2050 and 2045. I was just wondering how you deal with those in the warming projections or in the longer term.
Yeah, that's actually a good question. So the warming projection has been done a bit simplistic, because even only GCAM had like a climate model attached to it. So we kind of looked at and also non-CO2 emissions. So we looked at the share of non-CO2 emissions, and then we replaced the CO2 share of the GCAM outcome with all the models and see where they go to. And then also importantly, like for the models that go to 2050, we only use the intensity scenarios because you can basically calculate until 2050 where they go. The price scenarios are not included in the temperature graph there because it is impossible to know indeed. I mean, they are included in the graph, I think, but they don't go beyond 2050.
Very good.
I thank you, Jay, for the concluding words. I mean, this is, I think, very relevant. All these small stuff that are built into models are indeed. We at some point at the harmonization trajectory, we had to stop. I mean, it was not possible to harmonize everything there.
It's hard work you've taken on, but very important work.